The day my grandmother passed away, I believed losing her would be the hardest thing I would ever experience. I was wrong. 3 weeks later, my mother knocked on my front door. She was not alone. My younger brother David was standing beside her with 2 large suitcases. Before I could even ask why they were there, my mother looked me straight in the eyes and said, "We came for the keys." At first I laughed because I honestly believed she was joking. Then I noticed neither of them smiled. That was the exact moment I realized they were completely serious. They believed the house I had inherited already belonged to David, and they expected me to hand it over without a fight. My name is Emma Carter. I am 58 years old, and until that moment I believed I knew my family better than anyone. I believed that even when we disagreed, we still respected one another. I believed that blood meant something. Unfortunately, life has a strange way of exposing people when money or property becomes involved. Sometimes people spend years pretending to respect you. Then one unexpected inheritance reveals who they really are. Looking back now, I realize the warning signs had always been there. I simply chose not to see them because I wanted to believe the best about the people I loved. My grandmother Eleanor was the strongest person I have ever known. She raised 3 children while working 2 jobs after my grandfather passed away unexpectedly. Nothing in her life came easily. Every dollar she earned came from years of hard work and sacrifice. Even after retirement, she refused to depend on anyone. She loved gardening. She loved reading on the porch every evening. And more than anything else, she loved the small lakeside house where she had lived for almost 40 years. It was not a mansion. It was not worth millions of dollars. But to her, it was home. Every birthday, every Christmas, every family dinner, every important memory somehow found its way back to that little house overlooking the lake. To everyone else, it was simply an old property. To my grandmother, it was a lifetime of memories. As the years passed, her health slowly began to decline. She never complained because that was not the kind of woman she was. Even on difficult days, she would smile and tell everyone she was doing just fine. My brother David rarely visited because he always claimed he was too busy. My mother usually stopped by once every few weeks, but most of those visits lasted less than an hour. I lived only 20 minutes away, so naturally I became the one who helped the most. I drove her to medical appointments, picked up groceries, cleaned the house, paid bills whenever she became overwhelmed, sat beside her during long afternoons when she simply wanted someone to talk to. None of it felt like a sacrifice because she had spent my entire childhood taking care of me. Looking after her during the final years of her life felt like the smallest way I could thank her for everything she had done. One rainy afternoon, about 6 months before she passed away, she asked me to sit beside her on the porch even though the weather was cold. She wrapped herself in a thick blanket and quietly watched the rain fall across the lake for several minutes before speaking. She told me something I will never forget. She said people often reveal their true character when they believe they deserve something they never earned. At the time, I smiled because I assumed she was simply sharing another lesson from her long life. Then she reached for my hand and squeezed it gently. She told me that after she was gone, I should never let guilt make decisions for me. I remember laughing softly because the conversation made me uncomfortable. I told her she would still be around for many more years. She smiled but said nothing else. Looking back now, I realized she already knew exactly what was coming. She knew a storm was waiting for me after she was gone. When my grandmother passed away, the entire family gathered for the funeral. Everyone cried. Everyone shared stories. Everyone spoke about how much they loved her. Watching them stand beside her grave, I believed we were grieving together. I believed sadness had brought us closer. I could not have been more wrong. Just 3 days after the funeral, the lawyer called and asked me to come to his office. I assumed it was routine paperwork because my grandmother had always been organized. Never for a second did I imagine that meeting would completely change my relationship with my own family, or that a single envelope would eventually lead my mother to stand on my front porch demanding the keys to a house that had never belonged to her. And as I sat inside the lawyer's office waiting for him to begin reading my grandmother's final wishes, I had absolutely no idea my life was about to change forever. The lawyer greeted me warmly and offered me a seat across from his desk. His office was quiet and filled with old books that reminded me of my grandmother's living room, For a few moments, he spoke about what an extraordinary woman she had been and how much he had respected her over the years. Then he opened a large folder and carefully removed several documents. He explained that my grandmother had updated her will less than a year before she passed away and that she had been very clear about every decision she made. I listened quietly because I expected a simple conversation about family keepsakes and personal belongings. Instead, he slid one document across the desk and pointed to a single paragraph. The lakeside house, along with everything inside it, had been left entirely to me. For several seconds I could not speak. I looked back at the lawyer because I honestly believed there had been some kind of mistake. My grandmother had 3 children and several grandchildren. I never expected her to leave the house to only one person. I quietly asked if everyone else had already been informed. The lawyer nodded and explained that each family member would receive a copy of the will later that afternoon. He also told me something that stayed with me long after I left his office. He said my grandmother had insisted that there should never be any confusion about her wishes. She wanted the transfer of ownership completed immediately. She had signed every document personally and reviewed everything more than once. According to him, she had been determined to make sure nobody could challenge her decision after she was gone. Before I left, he handed me one final envelope. Unlike the legal papers, this one had my name written on the front in my grandmother's handwriting. The lawyer smiled gently and explained that she had instructed him to give it to me only after the will had been read. My hands were shaking as I opened it because seeing her handwriting again made everything feel painfully real. Inside was a short letter. She thanked me for every hospital visit, every grocery trip, every quiet afternoon we spent together on the porch. She wrote that I had never helped her because I expected anything in return. I had simply loved her. Then came the sentence that brought tears to my eyes. She wrote that the house was never a reward. It was her way of making sure I would always have a place where I could find peace whenever life became difficult. Reading those words felt like hearing her voice one last time. I drove to the lakeside house that evening, carrying the letter beside me on the passenger seat. The sun was beginning to set across the water exactly the way my grandmother loved. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. Everything looked exactly as she had left it. Her reading glasses still rested beside her favorite chair. A half-finished puzzle remained on the dining table. One of her gardening hats still hung beside the back door. For a long time, I simply stood there listening to the silence. The house did not feel empty. Somehow it still felt full of her presence. I walked slowly through every room remembering birthdays, Christmas mornings, family dinners, summer afternoons. Every corner carried another memory. I promised myself I would protect those memories because that house was more than wood and stone. It was the final piece of my grandmother's life. Over the next 2 weeks, I spent most evenings cleaning the house and organizing her belongings exactly the way I believed she would have wanted. Several relatives stopped by to collect small items she had specifically left for them. Most visits were peaceful and respectful. My mother came once and hugged me tightly before quietly looking around each room. David arrived a few days later with his wife Lisa. They stayed less than 15 minutes. David barely looked at the family photographs or the furniture. Instead, he kept asking practical questions. He wanted to know whether I planned to sell the house, whether the property taxes were expensive, whether I intended to live there permanently. At the time, I thought he was simply making conversation. Looking back now, I realize he was gathering information. Sometimes the questions people ask reveal far more than the answers they receive. About a week later, my mother invited me to dinner. The evening felt completely normal. We talked about work, shared old family memories, laughed about stories from my childhood. Then, just as dessert was being served, she casually asked whether I had thought about letting David use the lakeside house for a while. She explained that his apartment felt too small and that he had always dreamed of living somewhere quieter. I smiled politely and told her I had not made any plans yet because I was still grieving. She nodded and changed the subject so quickly that I hardly thought about it afterward. At the time, her question seemed harmless. I had no idea it was actually the beginning of something much bigger, because while I believed we were simply having an ordinary family dinner, my mother had already started building a plan in her mind. And only a few days later, she would arrive at my front door with David standing beside her, carrying 2 heavy suitcases, ready to move into a house that had never belonged to either of them. 3 days after having dinner with my mother, I finally understood why she had asked so many questions about the lakeside house. It was a quiet Saturday morning, and I had just finished making coffee when someone knocked on my front door. I assumed it was a delivery driver because I was not expecting visitors. The moment I opened the door, my entire body froze. My mother was standing there smiling as though nothing was unusual. Beside her stood my younger brother David. At his feet were 2 large suitcases. Behind him sat a moving truck parked across the street. Before I could ask a single question, my mother looked directly at me and said, "We came for the keys." For a second, I honestly laughed because I believed she was joking. Then I noticed David had already picked up one of the suitcases and was waiting for me to step aside. Neither of them smiled. Neither of them laughed. They genuinely believed they were about to move into my house. I looked from my mother to David and asked what was going on. My mother sighed as though I was making something very simple unnecessarily complicated. She calmly explained that David and Lisa had already packed most of their belongings because it made no sense for such a beautiful house to sit nearly empty while they struggled inside a small apartment. She spoke with complete confidence, as though the decision had already been made weeks ago. David nodded and added that he planned to set up his home office in the room overlooking the lake because it had the best natural light. Hearing him describe where he intended to place his furniture inside my grandmother's house felt almost unreal. It was as if I had accidentally walked into somebody else's conversation. I finally asked the only question that mattered. "Who told you that you could live here?" My mother answered before David had the chance. She looked at me almost with disappointment and quietly said, "I did." For several long seconds, nobody spoke. I searched my mother's face, hoping I would find some sign that this was all a misunderstanding. Instead, I found complete certainty. She genuinely believed she had every right to promise someone a house that had never belonged to her. I reminded her as calmly as I could that my grandmother had left the property to me. The will had already been finalized, and every legal document had been signed. My mother dismissed my words with a simple wave of her hand. She said paperwork was one thing, but family was another. According to her, I was thinking too much like a lawyer instead of a daughter and a sister. She told me David needed the house more than I did because he had a wife and children to think about. She said I already had a stable job and could easily continue living where I was. Listening to her explain why someone else deserved my inheritance more than I did left me completely speechless. David finally stepped forward and spoke for the first time. His voice was calm and surprisingly confident. He told me he had already accepted an offer on his apartment because Mom assured him everything had been arranged. At first, I thought I had misunderstood him. Then he explained that the sale had closed 2 days earlier and they would need to move their belongings immediately because the new owners were taking possession the following week. My stomach dropped. This was no longer a simple family disagreement. My brother had made major financial decisions based on a promise that should never have been made. I looked at my mother and asked whether she had really told him the house would be his. She did not hesitate. She nodded proudly and said she had only done what any loving mother would do. In that moment, I realized the situation was much worse than I had imagined. This was not an impulsive visit. This had been planned for weeks. I stepped outside and closed the front door behind me because I did not want this conversation happening inside the house my grandmother loved so much. The moving truck remained parked across the street with 2 men waiting patiently beside it. They looked confused because nothing seemed to be happening. David glanced at them before turning back toward me. He quietly admitted they had already paid the movers for the entire day. Every minute they waited was costing them money. Instead of feeling guilty, I felt something else. I felt deeply disappointed. Nobody had asked me whether I agreed with any of this. Nobody had called to discuss it. Nobody had respected my right to make decisions about my own property. They had simply assumed I would give in because saying no to family would make me feel selfish. Looking back now, I realized that assumption became the foundation of everything that followed. I took a deep breath and told both of them as calmly as I possibly could that they would not be moving into the house. My mother immediately became frustrated. She said I was embarrassing the family in front of strangers. David looked shocked, as though he genuinely believed I would change my mind at the last second. Then my mother said something that completely changed the direction of the conversation. She looked me straight in the eyes and quietly said, "Your grandmother promised that house would always stay in the family. She never intended for you to keep it all to yourself." The moment those words left her mouth, I knew there was something she was not telling me. Because my grandmother had been many things, but she had never spoken in half-truths. And if my mother believed she had made a promise like that, then somebody was lying. I simply did not know who yet. After my mother said those words, I stood there in complete silence. The wind moved gently through the trees surrounding the lake, while the moving truck remained parked across the street, waiting for instructions that were never going to come. I looked at my mother and quietly asked one simple question. "When did Grandma tell you that?" She answered without hesitation. She said, "Your grandmother told me years ago that the house should always belong to family and that David would eventually raise his children there." For a brief moment, I actually questioned my own memory. Had my grandmother really said something like that? Then I remembered every conversation we had shared during the final months of her life. Every word she carefully chose, every letter she left behind, none of it matched what my mother was claiming. The more I thought about it, the less sense her story made. I slowly reached into my purse and removed the letter my grandmother had written to me. It had become something I carried almost everywhere because reading it made me feel close to her. I unfolded it carefully and looked down at the familiar handwriting. There was not a single sentence suggesting I should give the house away. There was not a single sentence saying anyone else deserved it more than I did. Instead, every word spoke about protecting my peace and keeping the lakeside home exactly as she had intended. I looked back at my mother and calmly told her that Grandma had left me very clear instructions. She wanted me to have the house because she believed I would protect it. My mother shook her head almost immediately. She refused to even look at the letter. Instead, she insisted that conversations mattered more than written words. That answer told me everything I needed to know. She did not have proof. She only had a story she wanted everyone else to believe. David remained unusually quiet throughout most of the conversation. Then he finally admitted something that completely surprised me. He said Mom had been talking about this plan for almost 2 years. According to him, she repeatedly told him not to worry about buying another house because Grandma always intended for the lakeside property to stay with him. Hearing those words made my heart sink. My brother had genuinely believed this for years. He had built his future around promises that were never hers to make. Looking at him, I no longer saw someone trying to steal my inheritance. I saw someone who had trusted the wrong person. That realization did not change my decision, but it changed how I viewed him. Sometimes people become part of someone else's manipulation without fully understanding they are being used. My mother became more emotional after realizing I was not changing my mind. She reminded me that David had children while I lived alone. She said children deserved a yard to play in and fresh air to grow up around. She talked about family responsibility and sacrifice. She even reminded me of moments from childhood when she claimed I had always been the more independent one. Listening to her speak, I noticed something strange. She never once mentioned what my grandmother actually wanted. Every argument focused on David, his needs, his future, his family. My grandmother had somehow disappeared from a conversation that should have been entirely about honoring her final wishes. That was the moment I understood this was never about respecting Grandma. It was about correcting an outcome my mother did not like. I calmly told David that I was sorry he had sold his apartment based on promises he should never have received. I genuinely meant every word. None of this was his fault alone. But I also explained that I could not sacrifice my grandmother's final gift simply because someone else made assumptions about it. He stared at the ground for several seconds before quietly asking where he was supposed to go now. That question stayed with me because I knew it came from a place of fear rather than entitlement. Before I could answer, my mother interrupted and said he would not have to go anywhere because eventually I would come to my senses. She spoke with such certainty that it almost sounded like she believed refusing today simply meant agreeing tomorrow. I realized then that she had absolutely no intention of accepting my answer. Eventually, the movers climbed back into their truck and drove away. David loaded the suitcases into his car without saying another word. My mother stopped beside me before getting into her own vehicle. She looked disappointed rather than angry. Then she quietly warned me that the rest of the family would never understand what I had done. She said people would believe I chose a house over my own brother. After saying those words, she closed the car door and drove away. I stood alone in the driveway watching both vehicles disappear around the corner. Part of me wanted to believe the situation was finally over. Unfortunately, I knew my mother too well. She had never accepted losing an argument quietly. And deep inside, I had the uncomfortable feeling that today's visit had only been the beginning. Because if she could not convince me herself, she would almost certainly find someone else who might. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept seeing my brother standing in my driveway beside those two suitcases. He had looked so certain that he would be walking into the house as its new owner. The image would not leave my mind. By morning, I realized something far more troubling than the argument itself. My mother had never once asked me for permission. She had never tried to negotiate. She had acted as though the decision had already been made long before anyone spoke to me. That thought stayed with me as I drove to the lakeside house because something inside me kept saying there were still pieces of this story I did not know. I could feel it. My grandmother had been too careful and too organized for any of this to happen without leaving answers somewhere. As I unlocked the front door, I immediately noticed something unusual. The kitchen window was slightly open. I knew I had locked every window before leaving the previous evening. My heart began racing as I slowly walked through each room. Nothing appeared to be missing. The furniture remained exactly where it belonged. The photographs were still hanging on the walls. But when I entered my grandmother's bedroom, I stopped in my tracks. Several drawers had been opened. Someone had clearly searched through them. The contents were no longer neatly folded the way my grandmother always kept them. At first I wondered whether I had simply forgotten closing them. Then I remembered something. My mother had kept a spare key to the house years ago for emergencies. My grandmother never asked for it back. Suddenly, the timing of yesterday's visit felt much more unsettling. I immediately called my mother and asked whether she had been inside the house while I was away. She sounded surprised by the question. Then she admitted she had stopped by 2 days earlier because she wanted to collect a few family photographs. I asked why she had never mentioned that before. She quickly changed the subject and told me I was becoming suspicious over nothing. Her voice remained calm, but something felt different. She was answering my questions too carefully, almost as though she had already prepared those answers in advance. The conversation ended only a few minutes later, but instead of feeling reassured, I felt even more uncomfortable than before. My instincts told me there was something inside that house she had been looking for. That afternoon, I decided to search through every cabinet and every closet one more time. My grandmother had always hidden important documents inside old recipe books because she believed nobody would ever think to look there. It had become a family joke over the years. As I stood in the kitchen pulling books from the shelves one by one, I suddenly noticed a small envelope tucked behind an old cookbook that I had never opened before. My hands immediately began shaking because the envelope also had my name written on the front in my grandmother's handwriting. Unlike the first letter, this one was much smaller, almost as though she never intended anyone else to find it. I carefully opened it and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. The letter was short, but every sentence carried enormous weight. My grandmother wrote that if I was reading those words, it probably meant someone had started questioning her decision about the house. She explained that she had watched tensions growing inside the family for years. She had noticed how often conversations quietly returned to the property. She admitted that several relatives had already asked her what would happen to the house after she passed away. Then came the sentence that made my heart stop. She wrote that one person had asked more questions than anyone else: my own mother. According to Grandma, those conversations became so frequent that she eventually realized promises were already being made without her knowledge. She never wrote exactly what those promises were, but she wanted me to understand why she changed her will during the final year of her life. She said she needed to protect the house from becoming a source of conflict after she was gone. I sat at the kitchen table holding that letter for a very long time. Suddenly, every strange conversation from the past year began making sense. My mother asking about property values, David wondering whether I planned to sell, the sudden interest everyone seemed to have in the lakeside house. None of it had started after Grandma passed away. It had started while she was still alive. She had seen it happening long before any of us did. More importantly, she had quietly taken steps to stop it. For the first time since inheriting the house, I no longer questioned whether I was making the right decision. My grandmother had trusted me with something far more important than a piece of property. She had trusted me to protect her final wish. Just as I folded the letter and placed it back inside the envelope, my phone rang. The screen showed my cousin Rebecca's name. Her voice sounded nervous the moment I answered. She apologized for calling out of nowhere, but said she thought I deserved to know what the family had been discussing all morning. According to her, my mother had already started calling relatives. She was telling everyone that I had forced David and his children to become homeless because I cared more about a house than my own family. As I listened quietly, I realized exactly what was happening. My mother had lost the argument at my front door. Now she was trying to win it somewhere else. And before the day was over, my phone would begin ringing with calls from relatives who believed a story that was only half true. My phone started ringing less than 20 minutes after I ended the call with Rebecca. The first call came from my Aunt Susan. She did not ask what had happened. Instead, she immediately asked whether the rumors were true. She wanted to know if I had really refused to let David and his family move into the lakeside house. I calmly explained exactly what had happened from the beginning. I told her about the moving truck, the suitcases, the promise my mother had made without ever speaking to me. By the time I finished, there was complete silence on the other end of the line. Finally, my aunt sighed and admitted that the story she had been told sounded very different. According to my mother, I had inherited more than enough and simply refused to help my own brother during a difficult time. Hearing that confirmed what I already suspected. The truth had been carefully rewritten before it reached the rest of the family. Throughout the afternoon, more calls arrived. Some relatives simply wanted to understand what had happened, while others immediately took my mother's side. One uncle said family should always come before property. A cousin reminded me that David had children and needed stability. Everyone seemed to have an opinion, even though almost nobody knew the full story. I listened patiently to every conversation because becoming angry would only make matters worse. Then I began asking each person the same question. Did anyone tell you that Grandma left me a personal letter explaining exactly why she chose me to inherit the house? Every single person answered the same way. No, nobody had mentioned any letter. That was the moment I realized my mother had been sharing only the parts of the story that supported her version. Everything else had quietly disappeared. Late that evening, David called me for the first time since leaving the driveway. His voice sounded exhausted. There was no anger anymore. Only frustration and confusion. He admitted that he and Lisa were staying in a small hotel because the sale of their apartment had already been completed. Then he quietly asked whether we could meet somewhere without Mom. I agreed immediately because for the first time I felt he genuinely wanted answers instead of an argument. We arranged to meet the following morning at a small cafe overlooking the lake. As I hung up the phone, I kept thinking about something my grandmother had written in her second letter. She believed promises had already been made without her knowledge. Tomorrow I intended to find out exactly what those promises had been. The next morning, David arrived looking completely different from the confident man who had stood in my driveway only 2 days earlier. He looked tired, worried, almost embarrassed. After we ordered coffee, he stared at the table for several moments before finally speaking. He admitted that Mom had been telling him for nearly 2 years that Grandma wanted him to have the house because he had children. She said Grandma only placed the property in my name temporarily because I was better with paperwork and finances. According to Mom, everything would eventually be transferred to David after Grandma passed away. I listened without interrupting because every sentence explained another piece of the puzzle. My brother had not invented this story. He had believed it because the person telling it was our own mother. I reached into my bag and carefully placed both of Grandma's letters on the table. David looked confused as he unfolded the first one. Then he silently read the second. I watched his expression change with every paragraph. His confidence slowly disappeared and was replaced by something much heavier: regret. When he finished reading, he remained completely silent for almost a full minute. Finally, he whispered something that genuinely surprised me. He said, "Mom never told me any of this. She never mentioned these letters. She never told me Grandma was worried about people fighting over the house." Hearing those words made me realize my grandmother had been right all along. She had seen this conflict coming long before any of us did. She knew exactly where it would begin. David rubbed his face with both hands before looking back at me. Then he admitted something that completely changed my understanding of the situation. 6 months before Grandma passed away, Mom had encouraged him to sell his apartment and begin planning for the move. She repeatedly told him not to worry because everything had already been discussed inside the family. She even suggested renovation ideas for the lakeside house and talked about which bedrooms his children would use. David confessed that he had never questioned any of it because he trusted her completely. Looking at him, I realized he had built an entire future around promises that existed only in one person's imagination. The real tragedy was that he had already sacrificed his own home, believing another one had been guaranteed. As we stood outside the cafe preparing to leave, David quietly apologized. He apologized for arriving with the moving truck, for assuming the house belonged to him, for believing I was trying to take something away from his family. I accepted his apology because I could finally see the truth. My brother had not been the architect of this conflict. He had been one of its victims. Unfortunately, our conversation ended with one final warning. Before getting into his car, David looked at me and said there was something I needed to know. Mom was organizing a family meeting for Sunday afternoon. She planned to convince everyone that Grandma had been manipulated before changing her will. And according to David, she intended to challenge Grandma's final wishes in front of the entire family. After everyone left the dining room, only my mother and I remained inside the house. The sun was beginning to set across the lake, just as it had on countless evenings when my grandmother was still alive. The silence between us felt heavier than any argument we had ever shared. My mother stood beside the living room window, looking out toward the water without saying a single word. For several minutes, neither of us moved. Then she quietly asked whether I really believed she had been trying to hurt me. I looked at her for a long moment before answering. I told her I did not believe she wanted to hurt me. I believed she had convinced herself that helping David was more important than respecting Grandma's final wishes. Somewhere along the way, she stopped asking what was right and started asking only what she wanted to happen. That was the moment everything began falling apart. My mother slowly sat down in my grandmother's favorite chair. The same chair where Grandma used to spend every evening reading while watching the lake through the front window. Seeing my mother sitting there made me remember something Grandma once told me. She believed people rarely woke up one morning intending to become selfish. Instead, selfishness often grew little by little through excuses that sounded reasonable at first. As I remembered those words, I realized they described exactly what had happened. My mother had not started by trying to steal the house. She started by believing David needed it more than I did. Then that belief slowly became an expectation. Eventually, the expectation became a promise. Finally, the promise became something she believed had to be fulfilled, no matter what my grandmother actually wanted. It had all happened one small step at a time until nobody stopped to question whether those steps were leading in the wrong direction. The first time since this entire situation began, my mother admitted she had made a terrible mistake. She quietly confessed that after seeing David struggle financially, she became desperate to solve his problems. The lakeside house looked like the perfect answer. She convinced herself that Grandma would eventually understand. When Grandma never changed her mind, she simply continued believing she could fix everything after the funeral. She lowered her head and admitted that bringing David to my front door with those suitcases was something she regretted almost immediately. She said she kept waiting for me to give in because she believed refusing would only be temporary. Instead, she watched the family slowly fall apart because of decisions she alone had made. Tears filled her eyes as she apologized, not only for what she had done to me, but for betraying Grandma's trust after everything she had sacrificed for all of us. A few minutes later, someone knocked softly on the front door. It was David. He stepped inside holding a small wooden box I recognized immediately. It had always sat on the shelf beside Grandma's fireplace. He explained that while cleaning through some old family belongings, he discovered the box had accidentally been packed with several items Mom brought home after the funeral. He wanted to return it because it belonged in the house. Together, we opened it carefully. Inside were dozens of old photographs, birthday cards, Christmas ornaments, my grandfather's pocket watch, and one final folded note written by Grandma many years before she became ill. It was not another will or another legal document. It was simply a short message to whoever owned the house after she was gone. She wrote that homes are never protected by locks or walls. They are protected by the people who choose love over greed. She hoped every person who entered that house would leave it with more kindness than they brought inside. Reading those words felt like hearing her voice one final time. David quietly looked around the living room before turning toward me. He told me he no longer wanted the house. What he wanted was his sister back. He admitted that during the previous weeks, he had allowed anger and disappointment to replace trust. Instead of asking questions, he accepted promises because those promises gave him hope. He apologized again, and this time I could see there were no excuses left. Only honesty. I walked over and hugged him because despite everything that had happened, he was still my brother. Families cannot erase painful memories overnight. But healing always begins with someone choosing honesty instead of pride. In that moment, I felt the first real sense of peace since my grandmother's funeral. Not because the conflict had disappeared, but because the truth no longer had to fight to be heard. Over the following months, life slowly became normal again. David and Lisa found another home that fit their family beautifully. My mother worked hard to rebuild the trust she had broken. It was not easy, and it did not happen quickly. Trust rarely returns all at once. It returns one honest decision at a time. Every Sunday, our family gathered once again at the lakeside house, just as we had when Grandma was alive. The conversations felt lighter. The laughter returned. Nobody spoke about ownership anymore because everyone finally understood what Grandma had been trying to protect all along. The house had never been the real inheritance. The real inheritance was the love, respect, and peace she hoped would survive after she was gone. Sometimes people ask whether I ever considered giving David the house after everything settled down. My answer is always the same: no. Not because I wanted to keep something from him, but because honoring the final wish of someone you love is one of the greatest acts of respect you can ever give. Every time I sit on the porch watching the sun disappear behind the lake, I think about my grandmother. I think about her strength, her wisdom, and the quiet way she protected me even after she was gone. The greatest gift she left me was never the house itself. It was the courage to stand firm when the people I loved expected me to surrender what was never theirs. Because sometimes protecting a dream is the only way to honor the person who dreamed it first. And every single evening, as the sunlight reflects across the calm water outside that little lakeside home, I smile knowing Grandma's final wish was never just fulfilled. It was protected, exactly as she hoped it would be.